Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something pretty fascinating today. The financial situation in British India, specifically in the 1920s, during those early years of the Montague-Chelmsford Reforms. You know, those reforms that were supposed to give Indians a bigger role in governing their own country? Well, as we'll see, it's not always as simple as it sounds. We have some excerpts from a speech by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. He was a huge advocate for social justice and would later play a key role in actually drafting independent India's constitution. The year is 1926, and he's standing before the Bombay Legislative Council, ready to deliver this pretty scathing critique of a proposed budget. But this is about more than just numbers. His words really expose this power struggle that's happening beneath the surface of these reforms.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. You have this backdrop of hope and excitement. The reforms are supposed to be bringing in this whole new era. But then Ambedkar's speech kind of throws a wrench in the gears. He really hones in on this disconnect between the promise of self-governance and the actual budget allocations.
So let's break this down a bit. I noticed that Ambedkar keeps making this distinction between reserved and transferred departments. Could you explain that to our listeners? What are those, and why are they at the heart of this whole debate?
Absolutely. To really understand the power dynamics at play here, you have to understand this division. Imagine the British Raj like a big machine, with all these departments managing every aspect of life, from education to law and order. After those reforms, some of these departments were transferred to Indian control, at least partially. Areas like education and healthcare, things that weren't considered quite as essential to maintaining so much authority, but the reserve departments, things like finance and the police. Those stayed firmly under British control.
So it's like giving someone the keys to a car, but keeping control of the steering wheel and the brakes.
Exactly. And Ambedkar is basically saying, hey, if you're serious about giving us more control, give us the resources to actually run these departments properly. And he uses this very clever approach. He pulls out these specific numbers to compare spending increases across the different provinces.
He calls out Bombay, in particular, and it really stood out to me how he compares Bombay to Burma, which was considered less developed at the time. What's going on there?
It's a powerful comparison. Ambedkar highlights that even Burma, despite being seen as less advanced, is actually seeing a bigger increase in spending on those transferred departments compared to Bombay. And that really drives home his point. The British administration is dragging their feet when it comes to funding the very areas that would allow Indians to actually govern themselves.
Almost like a test to see if the British are truly committed to sharing power or just giving lip service to the idea of self-governance. And Bedker doesn't hold back. He calls this disparity a grave scandal, which tells me this wasn't just some intellectual debate. This really hit a nerve.
Absolutely. You can imagine the frustration, the sense of betrayal many Indians must have felt. The reforms were this beacon of hope, and then the budget allocations just painted a completely different picture. This wasn't about spreadsheets. It was about power, about the British clinging to control even while they're claiming to be empowering Indians.
So what are the real-world consequences of this funding gap? What does it actually mean to withhold resources from these transfer departments?
Think of it this way. You can't run a school without teachers. You can't run a hospital without doctors. By limiting the funding for these essential areas, the British are essentially holding back progress in education, in healthcare, and social welfare. It's a subtle way of saying, sure, you can have a seat at the table, but we're going to control the menu.
So Ambedkar lays out the problem, but he doesn't stop there. He goes on to dissect the entire financial health of the Bombay presidency, and it's not a pretty picture. He talks about the shrinking surplus, the looming deficit. He even uses this phrase, hand him out, to criticize the finance member. Was he being overly dramatic, or was it truly that bad?
Ambedkar was known for his intelligence and for meticulously using data, so I don't think he was exaggerating. Remember this, right after World War I, India's economy is facing all these challenges. Loan repayments, a growing demand for public services. All of this requires really careful financial planning, and that seems to be what's missing.
Okay, so we've got this financial crunch happening in Bombay. But what I find really interesting is that Ambedkar doesn't just complain. He offers a solution: increase taxes. He even mentions this Taxation Inquiry Committee report, which seemed to have all these recommendations just sitting there. But the finance member pretty much ignores it. Why not just raise taxes to cover the funding gaps? Was that even a possibility?
That's where things get even more interesting. The Legislative Council, where Ambedkar gave his speech, they technically had the power to impose taxes. But there's a catch.
There's always a catch.
Exactly. The initiative for any new taxes usually came from the government, meaning the British administration. and they were oddly quiet about it.
Ah, so they give them the power to raise taxes,
Mhm.
but make it virtually impossible to actually do it.
Precisely. And then you have to imagine the public reaction. Trying to convince people who are already struggling financially to pay more taxes, that's not going to be a popular move. The British were in a tricky situation. They wanted to appear like they were giving autonomy, while still holding on to the purse strings.
Which takes us right back to that idea. This budget fight wasn't just about numbers. It was about who really had the power in India. Ambedkar is exposing the hypocrisy of the whole system.
Absolutely. He's not just asking for more money. He's demanding a change in priorities, a shift away from just maintaining British control towards actively developing India's resources and potential.
It's like he's laying the groundwork for a more economically independent India.
Exactly. He understands that true self-governance requires financial autonomy. He wants Indians to take control of their own economic future, even if that means making tough decisions.
Which makes you wonder how the British felt about all this push for more financial control. Were they threatened by it? Or did they see it as a natural part of the reforms?
It was probably a bit of both. They were committed to this idea of gradually giving more power to Indians, at least
Yeah.
in theory. But they were also very hesitant to give up control of the finances.
Makes sense. Whoever controls the money has the power.
Exactly. In this case, the battle over the budget shows us a much deeper struggle, a struggle over the future of India. Ambedkar's speech, with its careful analysis and bold proposals, became a rallying cry for those who wanted true self-determination.
It's amazing how he uses this financial document to expose the flaws in the colonial system. He's not just making emotional appeals, he's using data and logic to make his point.
That data-driven approach was one of Ambedkar's greatest strengths. He knew that using facts and figures was a powerful way to fight injustice and to advocate for real change.
So looking back at this budget debate, what does it tell us about the Montague-Chelmsford Reforms? Were they a real step towards self-governance, or was it all just an illusion?
That's the big question, isn't it? The reforms did bring about some important changes, there's no denying that. But as Bedker so clearly shows, those changes were often limited and met with resistance. The British weren't willing to fully let go, especially when it came to finances.
Like they wanted to give Indians some power, but still keep a tight grip on the most important parts of the government.
Exactly. That tension, that push and pull between British control and Indian aspirations, that's what makes this period so interesting. It's a story of progress and setbacks, of hope and frustration, and ultimately of the unwavering pursuit of self-determination.
I think it's important to remind our listeners that this deep dive into a budget debate from almost 100 years ago might seem like a very specific topic, but it reveals something really crucial.
Absolutely. And Bedker's critique reminds us that financial decisions, they're never just about the numbers. They reflect power structures, social inequalities, and a constant fight for justice and equality.
Like we're peeling back the layers of history to uncover these hidden stories of resistance.
And those stories are still relevant today, as Ambedkar showed. The fight for a more just and fair society often starts by looking critically at the budget, asking who benefits, who gets left behind, and what are the long-term consequences. Those questions matter just as much today as they did back then.
Well said. A huge thanks to you for taking us through this complex and fascinating deep dive.
It's been my pleasure. It's always exciting to delve into these historical events and uncover the hidden stories that shaped our world.
And to our listeners, we hope this episode sparked your interest in this period of Indian history and the lasting impact of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Keep exploring, keep questioning. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing. It's just